Dr.
Yeah.
Casa, if you like, we have a few housekeeping things
Oh, perfect. Oh, yes.
and I will be happy to introduce you. Okay,
Perfect.
a moment. Hi, everybody. Welcome. We're glad that you could join us today. This is the Eden Professional Development webinar, and I'm Faye Griffith-Smith. I'm a statewide family economics and resource management extension educator for Yukon Extension. And I serve on the Extension Disaster Education Network Professional Development Committee and will be the moderator today. We ask you to please take a moment and drop your name and institution in the chat box so that we know who we have with us today. And I also encourage you, if willing, if you would like to put your camera on, we would love to see you as well and have more of a group to enjoy this together. So I would like to share with you that our speaker today is going to be Dr. Douglas Casa, and he will be presenting Laboring Safely in the Heat, Considerations for Yourself, Your Staff, and Those You Educate. So a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, if you would please type them into the chat box, and I'll bring them up at the end of the presentation. We'd also like you to know that the webinar is being recorded today, and it will be emailed out and posted to Connect Extension, the Eden subgroup, and also the Eden YouTube within a day or two. The evaluation link will also be included in the follow-up email with the recording. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Dr. Douglas Casa is the CEO of the Korey Stringer Institute since it was founded in 2010 and is a Board of Trustees Distinguished Professor of Kinesiology. He began at Yukon in 1999, and Dr. Casa was inducted into the NATA Hall of Fame in June 2024 and the University of Florida Hall of Fame in 2012. He is a fellow at NAK, NATA, and ACSM. The mission of the Korey Stringer Institute is to provide research, education, advocacy, and consultation to maximize performance, optimize safety, and prevent sudden death for the athlete, warfighter, and laborer. Additionally, he is the editor of a book titled Preventing Sudden Death in Sport and Physical Activity, second edition, 2017, published by Jones and Bartlett in cooperation with the American College of Sports Medicine. Another book titled Sports and Physical Activity in the Heat, Maximizing Performance and Safety, was published by Springer in the winter of 2018. His latest book, Elite Soccer Players Maximizing Performance and Safety, was published by Routledge in 2020. Dr. Casa has published about 400 peer-reviewed publications, book chapters, and presented more than 700 times on subjects related to maximizing performance in the heat, exertional heat stroke, heat-related illnesses, preventing sudden death in sport, and hydration. In the 15 years since KSI was founded, the organization has published over 300 peer-reviewed publications and received more than $34 million in funding. He has an H index greater than 80. As a licensed athletic trainer, Dr. Casa has successfully treated 425 cases of exertional heat stroke with 0 fatalities. In addition, from 2018 through 2021, he has served on the International Olympic Committee Adverse Weather impact expert group for the Olympic Games Tokyo 2020, which took place in 2021, that focused on the extreme heat anticipated for these games. With that, we want to warmly welcome Dr. Casa.
Thank you so much for that intro. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes and then we'll have about 10, 15 minutes for questions. So I'm just going to get started. And there we go. All right, so these are just my disclosures. This is a required slide for the University of Connecticut. Those are our 9 corporate partners and other places in which we receive funding. I was already mentioned, so I'm not going to read this whole list here, but that is the mission of the Korey Stringer Institute. Since we were founded, I'll talk a little bit more about our institute when we get going. Just a little bit about my background. It was mentioned already, my clinical work to treat heat strokes and our research work related to publications. But 2 other elements that I think you'll find interesting. One is I've been an expert witness on more than 80 cases of exertional heat stroke, about half of them in the laborer space and about half in athletics. That's very relevant because there's a lot that can be learned from the cases in which I've worked, because obviously if a lawsuit has transpired, that means something went wrong. Somebody either died from heat stroke or has permanent complications related to the heat stroke. It says up at the top, really 4, because when I was 16 years old, I suffered an exertional heat stroke myself running a 10K race on the track in Buffalo on August 8th, 1985. And that is relevant because obviously that steered the ship for the last 40 years for what my interest is and why I pursued this particular profession. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit too. So the overview today of some things we're going to hit is identifying reasons why heat is a hazard. We're going to talk about some of the common exertional heat-related injuries and illnesses. We're going to talk about some things you should have in your heat stress management plans. And we're going to talk about the negative effects of heat stress on health, safety, and productivity outside the landscape just of heat illnesses itself. All right. I always have this person in every single slide. This is the every single presentation I do. That's the athletic trainer who saved my life, Kent Scriber, Ithaca College athletic trainer who was volunteering that day back in August 1985. I also want to just briefly mention, you said it in the bio that I've been working at UConn since 1999. Anybody who's a college basketball fan knows that we've had a good run since I arrived. They've had 18 national championships in men and women's basketball, and my office is in the building where they play. So it's been fun to enjoy that success in addition to the great work I've been able to do from a heat safety perspective. This is the book that was noted. We're going to talk about some of the elements of this book here today. We talk about, so I just wanted to make note of that. That was noted in the bio. This is just an example of some of the companies we've worked with related to laborer safety. We're the heat mitigation provider for UPS and for Delta Airlines. So we manage a lot of their heat safety protocols. A good story, the safety manager for UPS was speaking at a TED-Ed style talk in New York City in September of this past year in 2025. And he noted in the 2 years since they had hired KSI, they had a 50% reduction in heat illnesses across their 400,000 employees. So that gives you an idea of some of the work we've been able to do to help some of these companies. But you take UPS, Delta, and the union that represents the National Association of Letter Carriers in America, and that's over about 1.5 million workers in America who were in the heat every day, like in the summertime. So just give you an example. There's others as well. We're helping with heat safety for some of the largest AI farms that are being built right now in Texas and other locations. But this just to give you a broad stroke of some of the work. Where we do some of the work in the labs at University of Connecticut is we have 2 state-of-the-art heat labs where we can control the temperature from -20 up to 120 degrees, full cloud to full sun with radiant heat lamps, humidity from 20 to 90%, wind from 0 to 20 miles an hour. So we can kind of recreate almost any work situation laborers would face, so that we can assess different things that we want to test to see how they impact people's ability to do exercise or their job in the heat. Things like supplements, medications, heat acclimatization, hydration, cooling strategies, cooling products, things like that. This is the brand new one that just opened in Gamble Pavilion. This is a $1 million facility that also has all the parameters I just mentioned of the other one, but this also can take altitude up to 12,000 feet as well. because there's a lot of work situations, athletic situations, and military situations where people at altitude, but also still have to do their job or sport. We're also super fortunate that we have our first satellite location at the University of North Florida. Our first two faculty members started there. This is in Jacksonville, Florida, this past August. We have a brand new heat facility at the lab there that's opening this May. Why this is relevant is we wanted a location that's in the heat all the time because we want to study laborers who are in the heat all day, every day, and to see the health implications both acutely and long term and what it has on them. And we just don't have that at UConn. So we worked over the last 4 years to have our first satellite facility. So when talking specifically about laborers, there's some really important things or demarcations between them and military personnel and athletes. Couple things to consider. Military, almost every soldier is between ages 18 and 28. Like 96, 7% of our military is in that age group. Sports, most athletes in America, high school, college athletes, most pro athletes are in their teens or their 20s. Those people tend to not have comorbidities. They don't are not on a lot of different medications. In sports, people are not doing 10, 12-hour work shifts. So here you can see individual factors that are very different for laborers. So we try to focus on these things and understand how they can impact safety in the heat. So medical history, comorbidities, medications, age differences, often no phase-in period. So there's no opportunity to get heat acclimatized. Like day one, they're just doing the schedule that everyone else is doing. No data on female laborers. Less than 10% of all studies done in laborers in the heat have been done with women, even though 47% of all laborers in the heat in America are females. Diverse schedules. People cannot miss work in some settings. Obviously they don't get paid, so it's not like they can't just call in sick that day. They have to just show up sick because they have to get paid. So they show up with 103-degree temperature and still do their normal 10 or 12-hour workday. Greater risk of chronic heat issues because these people are chronically dehydrated day after day, 2, 3, 4,000 days in a row. They're very dehydrated, because they have a 10, 15, 20, 30-year career. And they're also super hyperthermic many of those days, so high body temperature. And now we're starting to understand that has big, big issues related to chronic kidney problems and other medical issues because of that progressive load. I'll give you just one example, and I have many of them, but I was in New Mexico a couple years ago on a lawsuit that I was involved with. And there was an oil and gas facility. People did 12-hour shifts. They were 14 days on and then 10 days off for their cycle. And then they would go back home for wherever they're from. And so imagine doing a 12-hour day, and then you still have 13 more days in a row. The 2 days I was there, it was 120 degrees each day. And it's a 90-minute drive on a dirt road to get to the paved road and a 30-minute drive on the paved road to get to their hotel. So they leave their hotel at 4:30 in the morning, and then they get back, somewhere around 9 o'clock at night, try to have a dinner, go to bed for a few hours, drink as much as they can, and then go back to that next work shift again the next day. So not surprisingly, the place I was at had 5 heat stroke deaths out of just 400 people in the past year. And uh, Ironically, the two of the people that passed away that I was representing, one was making 330,000 a year and one was making 290,000 a year, super skilled workers. And the people who were employing them didn't make even the most basic things to take care of them in terms of shade, hydration. Obviously, they need cooling strategies for heat stroke on site because it'd be a 4 hours round trip from the moment you call for an ambulance. So a lot of strategies that need to be considered. I calculated out that all of the cooling and hydration strategies for all 400 workers for the entire year would only be $300,000. And the 5 lawsuits settled for about $100 million total in 1 year. So it just gives you an idea. And they're making hundreds of millions of dollars a year there from the oil that they're producing at those facilities. Structural factors we need to consider in the labor space that are also unique and a little bit different than military and sport. You obviously have more prolonged heat exposures. The type of workday that I just described in New Mexico, if they're in unions or not, immigration status issues. Unions is a very important factor, massive protector, much less likely to die if people are in unions. That's what the data shows. Also interesting in America, the one industry that's illegal to unionize for a federal perspective of unionizing is farmers. Many people do not realize that, but just after the Civil War, a law was passed that farmers, from a federal perspective, can't unionize. So it's an industry that I think is more challenging in that industry to protect workers. Stakeholders differ. No on-site medical staff in a lot of occasions, and sometimes there is. And I mention that because in the military setting, there's always on-site medical staff at basic training, and in athletics in high school and college, there's almost always on-site medical staff. Remote settings must think of heat hazards with other hazards and cannot often change the schedule of work. So these are just things as a backdrop that I wanted to mention early on in my talk. I've coined it the heat tax. These are different extra costs that companies bear because their laborer, their employee has to do it in the heat. So these are just an example of some of them. Decrease worker productivity. Okay, whenever you do something, if you're dehydrated and you're hypothermic, you're just going to do it less often and less well, meaning your accuracy, things might have to be redone more often, or you're doing it less often. Decrease productivity if they temporarily have to leave the work setting, right? If you get hot or dehydrated, you might have to take additional breaks. You might not have an immediate replacement for that particular job. Increase the cost of replacement the worker while the injured worker is out. If they're, have a heat issue, you obviously have to get another person in to do that task. Direct medical costs associated with the acute medical care. A heat stroke that's not treated properly, that has long-term complications, that easily you're looking at $500,000 to $1 million of cost, and that would be very low end for a person who has a heat stroke. Okay. Costs associated with long-term workman comp, because obviously now that person might not be returning for a while or ever. Legal costs associated with the lawsuits. I just mentioned to you just two cases I was on. One settled for 19 million, one settled for 21 million. That's just the settlement. That doesn't even count all the legal fees. Then legal costs associated with paying the settlement or the jury award. So this is just an example of all the additional costs that the heat might bear on a company. So at least this is data from a couple years ago, but to give you an idea of two departments in America, the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Housing and Urban Development, together they're about $100 billion in costs each year our government spends. But I just use that as an example because each year in America, we give up about $100 billion because of lost productivity related to working in the heat. Because it has a massive economic burden. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more. These are just an example of some of the publications we've had over the last few years related to people laboring in the heat. It's just a bit of a snapshot, and we'll bring up some of these through the talk. So I want to start here in terms of some of the more specific heat content, and I chose these data points on purpose because I was born in the 1960s. I'm 57 years old, and we're obviously in the 2020s right now. It's not the complete data set, obviously, yet. But just in my lifespan, heat wave frequency has tripled and the heat wave season has tripled. Okay. Humans have lived on planet Earth for between 300 and 400,000 years. And in my tiny lifespan, these two items have tripled. Okay. And it's happening. It's not like really a linear, it's a bit of an exponential increase that we're seeing. So obviously, what does this look like? What my college students graduating at UConn that we're training now, what is their work life going to be over the next 40 years? What kind of heat issues will they have to deal with for the soldiers they work with, or the athletes they work with, or the laborers they're working with? So it's just something to consider. Even the best climatologists in the world underpredicted the rate at which we would see this change. So taking a step back and what I mentioned earlier, the different avenues that we're considering that this heat is having an effect, productivity issues, we'll talk about some of those, acute health and safety effects, and then chronic health and safety effects. And ultimately, this is probably going to be by far the biggest cost burden for companies because now once we start figuring out that the 45-year-old medical problem is actually related to them being dehydrated and hyperthermic for their entire work career and nothing to do with what have happened naturally, we're going to see, I think, a lot of different issues related to what costs the companies are going to bear for this in terms of long-term disability. So when we talk about productivity loss, there's a lot of different ways that this can show itself, right? Lost work time, reductions in actual work output when you're there. The quality of work could be less, so things have to be either redone or checked more often. Physical and cognitive performance reductions. So obviously there's an economic cost associated with that for any company. We have found working with companies that productivity issues is actually sometimes our best avenue for success for getting them to implement heat safety strategies, because some of them seem to be more, um, I don't know, in tune or can sell it more if it's a productivity issue versus a health and safety issue. Um, Along these lines, you might find it interesting that KSI recently developed a partnership with the Hartford, which is one of the largest insurance companies in the world that does workman comp claims, because they're interested in things that would make total sense. They want companies that are insuring to have less claims related to working in the heat. So they want us to be educating these companies that they insure, so that the companies will be better off because they have less people who have heat problems. And then the insurance company would be off because less people are making claims. So it's a win-win, but giving you an idea of where these companies are thinking, who are proactive. So some of the recent data, the United Nations released this just 2 years ago. They estimate that there's about 2 million workers, 2 billion, sorry, with the B, workers who are in the heat. Now, some of those are not technically doing their job. These are just people laboring for their food or their water in the heat. Um, this results in, you can see that number of non-fatal injuries. We think it's grossly underestimated, about 19,000 deaths annually, because there's such limited ways of that being reported accurately. But it's important to note these two items. 9 out of the 10 worker exposures, most time people are in the heat, it's not technically a heat wave. Okay, because heat waves, and it is different in different countries. But in America, for instance, it's usually defined as 3 consecutive days above 90 degrees. But so most times you're working and it's not technically a heat wave. And I mention that because we still want to have heat safety precautions in place, even when it's not extreme heat. Why it's relevant is that 8 out of 10 worker injuries in the heat occur outside of a heat wave. Okay, so most of the bulk of these things we're dealing with, it's not like a formal heat wave. Obviously, heat waves were even more cautious. But to be honest with you, during the heat wave, certain things, protections may kick in to take care of our workers, and maybe we're not doing enough just during times when it's just normally hot and maybe not excessively hot. We did 12 underwing airport evaluations for Delta over the last 2 summers. So these are workers in Phoenix and Vegas and Dallas and Austin, Texas and New Orleans and Miami, places where it's brutally hot, where these people are loading and unloading planes and fixing planes out in 120, 130 degree temperature. These underwing evaluations are an example of like what we do at KSI to help people help companies figure out what they're doing in the heat, what are they doing well, what could they improve on. So proactive companies, like these are, using our knowledge to try to help their employees. I throw this number out here just to show you the survivability of heat stroke. I've treated 425 heat strokes with no fatalities, and that is the highest body temperature I've ever treated at the start of treatment of heat stroke, 112.8. A high school lacrosse player running a summer road race with his friends had this heat stroke, and just 40 minutes later, he was talking with us completely normally, and was completely recovered in a couple hours. We obviously did precautionary stuff with him, getting care at the hospital, but all that care was done on site with medical team at the road race. And the reason I say that is we need to have plans in place in the labor space because many labor settings are in remote settings, and you have a 30-minute window to get someone's temperature under 104 if you want to assure survivability. The average start temp is 108. So you could do the math out from the time someone goes down, you know about it, you make the call, the ambulance arrives, the ambulance is on site usually for 10 or 15 minutes, the ambulance goes back to the hospital has to get ready to cool somebody. Any math would always work out that you're going to be well beyond the 30-minute window to get someone's temp under 104. So companies need to have strategies in place of the concept called cool first, transport second, similar to like cardiac events, having AED placements. You don't wait to get to the hospital to do that. You do it right away. You do chest compressions right away. So similarly, like some of these companies, like we see in sports in the military, they have like licensed athletic trainers, which is the medical professional that is very well trained to deal with these acute emergencies. And now we're seeing a lot of companies hiring these, like Delta Airlines, Boeing, UPS, other companies that are now hiring athletic trainers. These AI farms that I told you about, these massive construction sites have athletic trainers on site. This is an example of some of the cooling happening via cold water immersion. There are other ways to cool, but that is the most effective modality. All right. So let's talk about identifying heat hazards. You obviously know it seems to perpetuate the American media all through the summer, especially 2 summers ago seemed to me maybe one of the worst summers in history. But 5 of the 6 most recent summers were our worst 5 in history in terms of the at least recorded history, the last 120 years. All right. So I know this graph I showed you already on the right side, but you can see the toll in terms of data that I thought you'd find interesting. Low-income earners are 5 times more likely to have problems in the heat. You could guess that maybe they have less protections in place. Black workers are 51% more likely, Hispanic workers 91% more likely. I think this might be connected largely with the farming industry and probably the industry that has the least protections in place. Performance decline, massive performance decline. So you could do a little bit to take care of people, and you get a more out of your workers. It's the top exertion-related death in laborers, the impact I mentioned to you before economically, and it's by far the top weather-related killer. You could combine every weather-related event in America, and it would not come close to the people who die from heat stroke each year. All right. So this, I think, is also underreported. That this is data just from California. But again, it's only the ones that are from companies where people are reporting it. And I just don't think that, especially illegal immigrants working on farms, I just don't think we're seeing all their data. But it extrapolates out to about 170,000 heat-related injuries in one state in a given year. And I do think it's grossly underreported, but I am going to show it to you because this is the data that they came up with. I mentioned it's the top exertion-related cause of injury on the work site. I think you'll find this super interesting, and they just changed this. I need to update this slide. Literally in the last couple months, every 1 degree Celsius increase, they're now saying it's a 2% increase in injuries. So you can go for like a moderate day that might be, say, 15, 20 degrees Celsius outside to a hot day could be 30 degrees Celsius outside, or 35 degrees Celsius. Even 40 degrees Celsius is like 104 degrees. And that gives you an idea. And it's not just from heat stroke or heat exhaustions. It's because people are more likely to get injured in general in the heat. You're much more likely to have cardiac events because your heart has to work harder. You're more likely to have slips and falls. A lot more mistakes happen. And so people just are more likely to be injured in the heat when they're dehydrated and hyperthermic. So another thing that we've looked at KSI is, okay, so when people have a heat stroke, are we going to be able to take care of them? So we looked at EMS services at every state in America, like what's their policy to take care of heat stroke. And here you can see a sliding scale from the darkest green is the best and red is the worst, meaning they have no policy. And not very, it's a depressing slide, obviously, but the worst states are the states that have the most problems, right? The Southeast states in America are almost, I don't want to say a great percentage of the heat strokes take place, the large majority. We see that in the military, largely because mostly of our basic training locations are here. In sports, in American high school football, almost all the deaths are in the Southeast and in the labor space. So the worst states to have a heat stroke in the labor setting are California, Texas, Florida, Louisiana, Georgia, Mississippi. Here you can give an example. So that means their EMS services are not good, meaning they're not going to be proactive with heat stroke care. All right. So that's something to consider, especially in the labor space. I mentioned to you before, almost half of the workers in America who are in the heat are women, but almost no research has ever been done with women in the labor space. So hard to contextualize what we've learned in men and just make this broad leap that it's relevant for women because it's just not true. A lot to learn still. So this is similar to I mentioned to you before with some of the productivity stuff, but if you have dehydration even before the workday starts, which I mentioned to you, if you have long work shifts, there's no way you're hydrated from the previous day. And then you have heat exposure from the work itself, the intensity, the clothing, the hazmat gear you might have on, being out in the open sun in a lot of situations, or in a super hot factory. Causes hyperthermia, could cause a lot of dehydration. And then these are some of the physical and things that we see related to that. Okay, so ultimately that all could lead to decreased physical work capacity. I helped two of the world's largest human rights organizations, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, try to improve worker situations for the workers who were building the World Cup sites in Qatar. For people who follow soccer, the World Cup was in Qatar in 2022. They moved it from July to December to take it like from 120 degrees down to 95 degrees. Um, but they had over 6,000 workers die. And those are just the ones that's what the human rights organizations reported. And those are the ones that they knew of die from working in the heat, because they had very little, or if none, heat mitigation strategies in place. But thankfully, through the efforts of these human rights organizations and a lot of publicity around this, they ended up building an $800 million facility to house the workers so they can be in air-conditioned places when they sleep and have potable water and showers and a good dining facility and then hydration provided during the workday. All of that did not exist, and why we ended up with 6,000 deaths. There's a great hour-long special on ESPN that aired November of 2022 that is an hour long that chronicles that entire saga. So here you can see some of the costs associated with the heat. The average cost per heat injury you see there, that's all of them together. That heat stroke could be way more expensive. But it just trying to give you some of the cost burden. And it's more than just the heat illnesses. So these are the things I'm trying to get people to think about. I mean, what effect does hydration have on your work productivity and what long-term issues related to being dehydrated? What effect does the UV exposure have all day on people? What does the acute heat stroke have? What is the cognitive decline? What effect does this have on people's work, personal lives away from their work life? All right. So these are things we're trying to get people to think about a little more broadly. In 2021, we published this article. It was a consensus statement, the first document really ever to pull all of these issues together in terms of best practices to protect workers in the heat. Um, I believe I shared this PDF with your organization, so that this can be shared with everybody who's on this presentation right now. But it had these different things within the article. We considered what effect cooling, education, heat acclimatization, hydration, environmental monitoring. These are the different things that we go through in that document to try to give a bit of a roadmap for people who are not heat experts. Okay, so we're talking specifically about the heat illnesses, which we'll get to in one second. When we have occupational heat stress, there's a lot of things that we have to think about in terms of health and safety, right? Obviously, the first thing that comes to mind are heat illnesses, which we'll talk about some of the specific ones. But you're much more likely to have falls and injury risk, orthopedic injuries and falls when you're dehydrated and hypothermic. The dehydration can cause kidney problems. There's a much greater cardiac strain when you're hotter and you're dehydrated. So we see a dramatic rise in like heart attacks and cardiac events. I mentioned to you before, kidney injuries. So these are just some of the global issues we're dealing with. All right. If you categorize them, thermoregulatory stresses of being in the heat, the muscular stresses, and the cardiovascular stresses. So the heart's working harder in the heat versus not. The muscles have to work harder, and obviously you're sending a lot more a lot more blood flow to the skin surface to try to enhance cooling. So the four most common heat illnesses that I'll briefly describe, but I'm going to spend a little more time on heat stroke because it's really the one of those that can kill you. Heat cramps, we're all familiar with it. That's the term. There is another term called exercise-associated muscle cramps because you don't have to be in the heat to have cramping. But it's usually associated with extreme fatigue, coupled for some people with hydration issues or electrolyte issues. It can happen in the absence, honestly, of hydration and electrolyte issues. It could just be extreme fatigue, especially unique, novel, new fatigue. But being dehydrated and electrolyte issues for some people also seem to exacerbate the cramping issues. So obviously the best treatment is stopping the activity, massaging it, resting it, and if they are dehydrated or electrolyte depleted, to replace those items. But the combination of rest and fluid electrolyte replacement obviously helps most people. Heat syncope is someone who faints during exercise in the heat, especially when you go from postural changes, especially causes like if you sit for a long time in the heat doing something and then you get up, that can cause fainting. Or if you're standing for a long time in the same spot and then you move, or sudden change in a kind of body posture, very closely connected with dehydration. Um, you get a lot of pooling of blood in the lower body, and we have less blood perfusing the heart. Blood pressure decreases, and the body protects itself by fainting so that the heart does not have to overcome gravity to get fluid back to the heart. So heat syncope itself is not like necessarily dangerous. The problem with syncope is where you happen to be collapsing. Okay, so if you're on a ladder, you're on a roof, you're doing something at a height, or you're just on the ground but you fall on concrete, you fall on a step, you fall on something sharp. That's where heat syncope can be very dangerous. So we always tell people if anyone ever starts to feel lightheaded, dizzy in any way, to immediately get themselves, if you're standing, sit down. If you're sitting, lay down. If you're on a rooftop, lay down on the roof because you might not have enough time to get all the way down. Like just get yourself safe and get yourself reestablished first. And so just immediately get yourself lowered to the ground, so that we don't have that potential dangerous fall. Okay, the best way to restore this is restored, within 10, 15 minutes for people. If they lay down, prop their legs above their heart, maybe put some cold towels on them and rehydrate people, and they'll usually feel better quickly. But the root cause is probably they were dehydrated, and maybe combined with overheated, which means more blood was going out to the skin surface and less blood coming back to the heart. So you also have to maybe consider those two issues. Heat exhaustion is basically a cardiovascular insufficiency, meaning the heart just really can't handle that big stress. And the big stress and the heat is the three parts of your body that are demanding blood at the same time: your skin, your muscles, and your heart. And you don't have enough blood in your body to make all three of those happy. And when you get dehydrated, you have even less blood. So there's less blood to go around for those three entities. So it's why when we do activity in the heat, performance decreases because we have a little less blood going to the muscle. We get really hot because ultimately we might stop sending as much blood to the skin surface because we want to conserve blood pressure, by sending blood to the heart. So it's not going to kill you. It's not associated with extreme hypothermia. It could, in a way, be protective because it has you stop exercise and recognize that something's wrong. So I personally would never send someone back to work on the same day with heat exhaustion because they're probably decently dehydrated, might be mildly hyperthermic, might be dramatically fatigued. So I would have them rest, rehydrate, cool down their body temperature, do it, maybe initially at work, but then have them go home and be in air conditioning. Might need a couple days off, and then reassess why it happened in the first place and maybe make changes in the future. The one that could kill people if it's not treated quickly is exertional heat stroke. The two diagnostic criteria of heat stroke are CNS dysfunction and a core temperature greater than 105 degrees. So if medical people on site would be doing that via rectal temperature, you don't use axillary, tympanic, oral, temporal, anything like that. They're grossly inaccurate. So CNS dysfunction, extreme hyperthermia. So, but we have to recognize it quickly because we have this 30-minute window if we want to assure survivability without long-term complications. So these is not accurate information. I want to point out to everyone because I know this is being recorded. So maybe someone is looking at a slide right now and maybe even doesn't have their volume on, so they're not listening to me. This is from the CDC, and this is grossly inaccurate. I just want to make sure people understand. Okay, dry skin. Okay, 425 cases of heat stroke I've treated. 424 of them were profusely sweating at the time of the exertional heat stroke. All right, the one that wasn't is because we found this mountain biker 30 to 60 minutes later after they went up the side of a mountain. All right. So the dry skin is unfortunately a holdover from the classic heat stroke, which is a medical condition that happens to kids or infants in parked cars in the summertime or elderly people during heat waves. But exertional heat stroke has usually they're going to be profusely sweating. All right. So the no sweating, not true for exertional heat stroke. Dry skin, not true for exertional heat stroke. Usually more above 104 or 5 at the time of the incident. So I just wanted you to see that. So we're comparing heat exhaustion with classic and exertional heat stroke. The labor setting, this is the what you care about is right here. Really high temp, likely CNS dysfunction, meaning people confused, combative, really slow to respond, could be completely unconscious, could be in and out of consciousness. That's what we mean by CNS dysfunction. They might be uttering some sentences that make sense, but then they might not really interact with you for a minute or two, and then they might say a couple words that make sense, but they're just not normal. Okay, so it's related to exertion, whether it be in sport or job. Hot, dry skin, you unlikely in heat stroke, very likely in classic heat stroke, and very unlikely in heat exhaustion. So I want you to just start to conceptualize what we're going to see. These are common things we see in exertional heat stroke. Okay, profuse sweating, confusion, high temperature, irrational behavior. We've treated people who are kicking, biting, screaming, punching. They will, because they're just not acting normally. They have no idea what they're doing. So this is kind of that survival window I shared with you before. We got to get their temp down with under 104 within 30 minutes. Once we get beyond the 30-minute window, it's literally Russian roulette. They might survive and be fine, or they might have permanent complications, or they might die. Okay, so we can't really control much beyond here, but history has shown us, at least in the almost 4,000 cases we've tracked, that you can survive without long-term complications if you stay in this window. All right. So we don't really think people should die from an exertional heat stroke. I do not think all cases of heat stroke are preventable. I do think death from heat stroke could be preventable if it's treated correctly. Okay. But I don't think all cases could be prevented because you're just sometimes not going to have workers tell you when they're sick. I mean, they might start work at 104-degree body temperature because they have the flu. And if no one tells you, it literally might be unavoidable, but we still have to treat the person after. All right. So here's some of the things. This is the kind of the last section of like, what do we do now to prevent heat problems from happening? So these are some of the things we're looking to consider. And I'll get through all these. So there's two levels of prevention. One is preventing the heat illness from ever happening in the first place, and then one's preventing the fatality from happening after it does present itself. So what are we talking about? It could be as simple as shade. It could be as simple as hydration. It could be altering work to rest cycles. All right. Um, it could be related to education. We have found profound benefits of education with helping workers. I mean, one is they can protect themselves, but two, in the buddy system, in a lot of work settings, they can keep an eye out for each other, and then identify problems earlier and maybe prevent more serious things or take care of serious things. I mentioned these, kind of alluded to some of this before, but heat hygiene, like what does that person bring to the table, that laborer, when they go to that work setting? Again, very different than what we see in athletes and in most military situations. Okay, because a lot of these laborers generally might be sedentary away from work. They might have diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, kidney disease, malignant hyperthermia, be on some medications that grossly hinder thermoregulation, sodium balance issues. They might be obese. So these are just things that make everything harder in the heat. All right. And these are some risk factors in addition to those things I just mentioned. Okay. They're not going to be shocking to you, but it's kind of a good reminder. If you know the risk factors, these are things that you might be able to alter to make it less risky, right? The temperature and humidity. So change the work to rest ratios, lower fluid consumption, have cold fluids that are nearby. Direct sun exposure. Can you make shade possibly in some work settings where people are in that same spot in the sun all day? Or can breaks be in the shade? Limited air movement. Could you encourage air movement by having some kind of circulation? Heavy physical exertion. It might not be able to be avoided, but you might be able to tweak the work to rest ratios. Bulky PPEs or hazmats outfits, you might have to, obviously protect them with certain work to rest ratios and or maybe cooling products. Smoking and tobacco use, poor diet, certain drug supplements, all those things could also and make it worse. Okay. We have found that workers just tend to arrive to work dehydrated. All right. So that doesn't surprise you if you have a 12-hour shift the day before. But that makes it harder in the next day of work. So some of the easiest ways to track hydration. Um, I have about another 6 or 7 minutes just so you guys know, and then we can do some Q&A. Some of the ways to track hydration, some of the simplest ways is urine color. Tell people to look at their urine color when they urinate or when they get up in the morning. The most accurate time is in the morning, but you can do it through the day. If it's light, like lemonade, you're probably hydrated. If it's darker, like apple juice, you're probably dehydrated. So that's one way. It's urine color. Another super easy way is thirst sensation. Okay. We have this amazing thing in our body called the ability to sense thirst. And if you're thirsty, you're usually beyond 2% body weight loss. So you're mildly dehydrated. So if you're thirsty, drink fluids. All right. If you don't urinate ever, you're dehydrated. If you're very infrequently urinate, you're dehydrated. If you have weight loss from one day to the next, you're probably dehydrated. So I don't know. I thought I had this slide here. Darn. Okay, so I'm going to get back to here. It's probably coming up, but it's something called the what principle we do. It's WUT. So it's weight, urine, and thirst. So those three things together are very, very helpful. So weight, urine, thirst. And weight is best to check every morning because if you're 3 pounds lighter from one day that from the previous day, you did not lose 3 pounds of fat in one day. Okay, so it is very likely to just be water losses and you're dehydrated from the previous day. All right. I'm not going to get into some of these real detailed stuff, but the things that help with hydration, having it accessible, having it cold, allowing people to drink during the day. It's really helpful when people can drink through the day and not just at formal breaks. So that might mean that, for instance, some people might have reservoirs they carry with them, or they're allowed to have the fluid near them. Heat acclimatization, I mentioned this earlier. This is the progressive phasing in the heat because your body goes through physiological changes through the first week or two of exercise in the heat, and it's really protective. All right. That's why most of our heat stroke deaths we see in the work and sports setting are in the first week. All right. Again, I'm not going to go through these exact details, but we encourage work settings to use like the first 2 weeks that someone's onboarding to a job or moving, say, an oil and gas worker going from North Dakota to New Mexico, a person coming back from a long vacation or from an injury. When they come back to use the first 2 weeks to onboard them, or at least the first week, so they're not jumping straight to the 12-hour shift. All right. So this is the benefits of heat acclimatization. These are just some of the big things, but like, and it's, core temp, heart rate, exercise capacity would be like performance, how you feel, all these things. So they look at the days. Basically, once we reach day 6 or 7, we're starting to see plateaus in most of the stuff except sweat rate. So all these are protectives. This is the percentage from day one. So you'll have much bigger plasma volume. That means there's more blood in your body. So your heart muscles and skin have more blood to share. Here is your heart rate's less, so you're working much less hard. So your heart rate's much, much lower. Okay. After just a week of working in the heat. All right. So that's why we try to protect people in that first week. Body cooling strategies, I think these are grossly underutilized. It could be as simple as shade, but it could be a little more aggressive by just having a worker have a cooler next to them filled with ice water and towels for themselves. So they can occasionally put some freezing cold ice water on their head or neck or on their back. Um, And also, they could keep a water bottle in that cooler so it can stay cold during the day. These are just some examples, but it would be based on if you have power or not at your work setting. It could be full immersion. It could be arm immersion. It could be fans. It could be ice slushies, water dousing, cold towels, cold vests. But vests would, obviously work best if you have power near you. So in hot factories, this is fantastic because they have fridges and freezers in the rest breaks, and they can change the vest out every hour and put on a different cold pack. So it just depends on what your work setting is. Cooling, though, the bottom line is the more surface area you're covering, the more effective the cooling strategy will be. So everything has to be considered within that context. We've done a lot of research related to exercise in the heat. I'm not going to go in great detail, but we did 2 big studies recently with people doing labor tasks in the heat. So looking at box lifting apparatus for a couple hours combined with walking in the heat. And these are just some examples of just simple things of just doing shade, some simple cooling strategies and hydration. And we saw like that just from a few hours, their body temperature was a degree less, their heart rate was 6% less, they had improvement in performance of about 12%. So this is just super simple and not costly at all. All right. Another study that we did was just looking at cooling versus not cooling and just for a few hours of activity, and we had a dramatic increase in performance. So when we're talking about cooling strategies, this was an algorithm in that document from 2021 that I noted before. And like, do you have power at your work site? Do you not have access to power? Yes, no's, because these are all the different cooling that you might consider based on where you funnel to for your work setting. All right, environmental monitoring is very, very important. There's something called wet bulb globe temperature. That's a fancy term for monitoring the environment. Never use heat index, okay? Heat index just uses humidity and temperature, and it does not factor in the sun. And heat index was originally developed for walking in the shade in a t-shirt and shorts. I just want you to know that I've never dealt with a heat issue when someone's walking in the shade in t-shirt and shorts. That's what it was originally developed for. That's what the whole measurement is based off of. Okay. So it's not relevant for doing intense labor in the heat when you might have on certain protective gear and you're in the sun and all these different factors. So we recommend something called wet bulb globe temperature. There's a company called Kestrel that makes these devices you could have on the work setting. There's a company called Periweather that makes more centralized units if you have a lot of people working in a centralized space. So I would make sure you have these, and this is how you dictate your work to rest ratios based on those environmental conditions. So on more extreme days, there'd be more breaks that are longer because obviously people need more time to cool down. Their sweat rate will be higher, so they need more time to hydrate. All right. So I mentioned to you why we're doing environmental monitoring. Um, I'm not going to get into all these, but this is how hard someone's working outside. So this is the intensity. So obviously, the higher the intensity, the less that you can handle outside. If it's low intensity, you could do more work in higher environmental conditions. So this is what, you can get this at NIOSH website, has some really, really good stuff on these work to rest ratios based on the intensity. People who are proactive, we're working with some of these AI farms right now that have all the workers, all like 12,000 construction workers at one site are wearing wearable technology. So their heart rates, they have ones for hydration sensors, and they have people wearing this so that they can detect issues early on and avoid problems in the first place. So that's just another thing to consider. All right, I'm not going to get into a ton of these. I'm not going to explain which ones work and don't work, but body temperature is very helpful. Hydration status monitoring, heart rate stuff is helpful. I had that slide before. So I just reiterating some stuff here. I'm not going to a little short on time. This original talk is for like an hour long. There's 7 states right now that have heat regulations in place. So it's getting to be a super interesting time in our country's history. During the Biden administration, we were working on a federal heat standard. It's not, I think, moving forward at this point. But as more states develop their own heat regulations, I think companies are just going to want a federal heat standard because you have companies like Amazon, UPS, and all these companies that work nationwide, and you might have 32 states eventually with their own standards, and it makes it more difficult for a company that's nationwide to have different standards in every single state. It might be better off to just have one federal heat standard. I did send these 2 articles as well to your colleagues that this PDF hopefully will be made available to you. But we just published 2 really user-friendly documents about laborers in the heat. And there's some really good diagrams you could share maybe with your coworkers. I'm just giving snapshots of, there's probably about 12 figures in the 2 articles that you might be able to utilize when you're creating your own presentations and you're educating your staff. All right. All right, so I hope that was helpful. I did pretty decent there in time. We have maybe like 10 minutes for a Q&A.
Dr. Casa, we want to thank you so much for your excellent presentation. You've given us a lot to think about today, and I think it has a lot of implication for our work in extension. We encourage you, if you have any questions you would like Dr. Casa, you can put those in the chat, or as we are a rather small group, you could even, I believe, unmute if you
Absolutely.
chose to. If you're like me, this has been much to think about. So, and I really appreciate all the information that you've shared with us. The evaluation link is in the chat, and we very much appreciate your taking the time to respond to that survey. Um, the recording will be sent out to you, as will the attachments that Dr. Casa has provided. And I'm sorry, I did not think to find information for the next webinar. Reagan, I don't know if you have that information, but I know that
Yeah,
the
I
next,
don't have it handy.
okay. So
Reagan, do you have those PDFs I mentioned? Can those be made available to the attendees?
Yes, we will be, we usually send out any associated slide decks or associated materials with the recording link, which usually takes a few days for us to get all of that sorted out. But yeah, we will send that. And I know that you tried to add it to the resource dashboard and we're not able to. So we'll figure a few things out too, but they will definitely be sent out with the email with the recording.
Good. Thank you.
we also want to let you know that if you're an Eden delegate and you'd like to join the Eden Professional Development Committee, that you can contact Connie Burnham at Missouri. And also, you are welcome if you have an idea for a future webinar. We would encourage you to submit. There is a submission form that is available on the Eden website. And I'm also going to ask Reagan if you are you able to put that submission form link in? That's fantastic. So any questions, anyone? That was a lot of information in a short time. So I think people will probably be thinking about this for a while and how it may apply to their work. So with that, again, just encourage you to let us know your thoughts, your ideas for future webinars. And with that, unless there is anything else, any questions, I think we're probably about ready to wrap it up. So thank you for attending today. And we just welcome you at future webinars.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.